friend. Welcome to the Battle for the Mind Ministries. I'm your host, Kendall Walker. If it's your first time here, it's a pleasure. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the little bell and subscribing. This ministry is dedicated to teaching the Bible, theology, apologetics, answering frequently asked questions, and much, much more. And best of all, it's all Bible-based. Battle for the Mind. Well, as promised, we're going to be looking at chapter 2 of the book of Genesis. We covered chapter 1 last week, and we dealt with our first acronym, the letter I, which spoke about the inception of the world, and we focused on one particular verse while we covered the entire chapter. That verse was Genesis 1, verse 26, where God says, let us, and he also uses the term our, and we uncovered a little bit more deeply exactly what that meant. Today we're going to look at chapter 2 in our second acronym, the letter N, which stands for Newlyweds Placed in the Garden. Newlyweds Placed in the Garden. So chapter 1, the letter I, chapter 2, the letter N, Newlyweds Placed in the Garden. Now, in beginning this, let me do this. Let me just run through a number of points within chapter 2, and I'll go back and highlight 3 or 4 points which I think are really worth repeating and noting. Again, issues that are sometimes problematic for people or issues that simply need to be fleshed out a little bit more. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, basically we read that God has finished his work of creation and then he rested, i.e. the Sabbath. And we see the importance of that as we look at the following chapters within the book of Genesis. In verse 4, we see the term the Lord God, verse 4. And then in verse 5, we see that God had made sure that there was no rain yet, again, verse 5. In verse 7, man is formed. And then in verses 10 through 14, Moses mentions several rivers. Now, what I would suggest is simply this. Grab a map, write down those rivers, and then draw a line from river to river to river. Why do I say that? So you can find out where man first began. And then in verses 15 through 17, Moses mentions 2 trees. He mentions the tree of life and the tree of good and evil in verses 15 through 17. And he gives a warning, and we'll cover this a little bit more depth in a few minutes, but the warning actually begins in verse 17. And then in verses 18 through 20, Moses names the animals. And then verses 21 and 22, God gives or places man into a deep sleep, takes out his rib and forms Eve. And then in verses 23 and 24, we see a marriage being instituted between Adam and Eve. And in verse 25, it ends with the phrase, they are not ashamed, even though they were naked. Now, having said all of that, let me go back and highlight some of the things which I think are really crucial for you to make sure you understand. And having said that, we'll begin in verse 4. I want you to notice in verse 4, actually, let me backtrack. Let me go back to verse 3, where it says, then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. Now, one of the things that's real important to understand is, what does the word sanctified mean? It means to set apart. Hence, God is setting apart this particular day. Why? Because it is going to become, as we'll read on later on, the Sabbath. Now, there's 2 things that are real important to understand. First of all, number 1, the Sabbath was made for the nation Israel. Hence, when you get to the New Testament, we never see the church commanded to take, to follow the Sabbath. Why is that important? Because there was one day that overruled the Sabbath, and that is the resurrection of Christ. And again, I mentioned this before. Just simply go back and look at our previous videos. I believe there's 3 or 4 videos that deal with the Sabbath. Another thing that's real important is as we get to verse 4, there's a phrase that occurs for the first time in Genesis 2, verse 4, and it continues several times throughout this book, and we'll see it followed up in numerous other books throughout the Bible. And that's the phrase, the Lord God. It's significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, the word Lord here is all capitalized, which basically tells us what? It tells us that God is using his divine name of Yahweh, YHWH. In other words, he says Yahweh Elohim, again, the divine name, and again, it becomes real crucial because God is now referring to himself with his divine name. And I want you to just remember that as you read on within the book of Genesis and throughout the scriptures themselves. Another thing that's real important is get to verse 5, and we not only see the word the Lord God again, but we see that God has not sent forth rain. Why is that important? And it's important because, one, it tells us that God has used another means to water the earth, hence not rain. Also, it becomes ironic because as we read a few chapters later and get to chapter 9, it's rain that God uses to do what? To destroy the earth. So again, we kind of see the irony here, but we see God's provision prior to the fall, prior to sin. And then I want you to drop on down to verse 17, and this is really crucial, so we're going to spend a little bit of time with this. In verse 17, now, before I read verse 17, just to remind you again, the paragraph actually begins in verse 15. So let me just read that, and we'll just move on from there. It says, then the Lord God, sound familiar? Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden ye may eat freely. Now, again, I mentioned this before, but let me just remind you, in case you missed it the first time, the Garden of Eden is about the size of New Jersey. Now, based upon the size of New Jersey, God has only done one thing. He's told man, you can eat of any tree, but one tree you cannot eat of, that's the tree of good and evil. Now, I want you to put yourself in that situation for one moment and think about that and really carry that out to the full extent. You've got a garden that's that large, and you can eat from every single tree in that garden except for one. What does man do? Just the opposite of what God told him. But I want you to notice also what God says in verse 17. But from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. Here is the warning. If you eat from this tree, what's going to happen? You're going to die. Now, some critics, some unsaved individuals, some cultists, they'll say, see, man didn't die. Man didn't die. No, the reality is God is a God of his word. Man did die. He didn't die physically. He died spiritually. He died spiritually. Since man died spiritually, I want you to think of a conversation that takes place in the New Testament. John chapter 3, where Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus. And remember who Nicodemus is. Nicodemus is a Pharisee. He's a teacher of the law. And as a teacher of the law, they were required to memorize certain aspects of the Old Testament. For example, they needed to know the first 5 books of the Bible, forward and backward. They needed to know the book of Psalms. Why are these books so important? Because these books really highlight who the Messiah is going to be. For example, we see in the Psalms that God has a son. We see in the first 5 books of the Bible the lineage of the Messiah. In fact, it's traced out through the book of Matthew and through the book of Luke. So as we look back into the Old Testament, one is able to figure out who the Messiah is going to be. In fact, it's interesting in this fact that the order of the Jewish Old Testament is slightly different from that of the Christian Old Testament. The Jewish Old Testament ends with the book of Chronicles. Incidentally, in the book of Chronicles, it actually has the order, the lineage of the Messiah. So I wish we had not changed that, because that would be a great way to end the Old Testament and hence introduce us to the New Testament, which Matthew begins with, guess what? The lineage of the Messiah. So that's why I said it would have been a great link if the church had not changed that. But nonetheless, the books are still complete. The order and the lineage and so forth is still there. But again, the point is simply this. What happened to man when he partook of that tree of good and evil? He died spiritually. That's why when Jesus talks to Nicodemus, what does Jesus tell him? You, meaning mankind, need to be what? Born again. Why? Because man was spiritually dead. Now when we get to the New Testament, Jesus is reminding them, they need to be made alive. Hence, born from above. In fact, that's nothing new to the New Testament. We see that all through the New Testament. Incidentally, we actually see that in the Old Testament. How do we know that? Well, very simply. I don't want to give away too much of this time, but there's two things I'd like you to do. I want you to go to the book of Hebrews and look at Hebrews chapter 11, because in Hebrews chapter 11, it mentions what they call the heroes of the faith. All these individuals are individuals who are saved, who believe in Messiah, and hence are recorded in the New Testament. Why? Because they show the life and transformation of these individuals, because they have put their faith in God. They have put their faith in Messiah. So again, real important to make sure we understand that in order for a person to go to heaven, that individual, it's not a matter of a denomination, it's a matter of transformation. It's a matter of being born from above, as Jesus communicated with Nicodemus that truth in John chapter 3. So again, let me just backtrack real quickly. In chapter 1, we had the letter I, which began the term or our acronym, Inception of the World. Chapter 2, the letter N, Newlyweds are placed in Eden. And as we continue, we're going to look at more acronyms that will cover all 50 chapters of the book of Genesis. Until then, may God bless you.